The phone slipped from my trembling fingers, clattering onto the marble floor of my penthouse apartment. Those words echoed in my mind like a death sentence. "Dad, you're just a burden now. We can't keep taking care of you anymore." 3 hours later, my daughter Rachel stood in my living room, her face drained of all color, staring at the bank statement in her hands. What she saw there changed everything between us forever. You won't believe what happened next. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in my downtown Chicago high-rise. At 74 years old, I'd grown accustomed to the routine that had replaced the chaotic schedule of my working years. Coffee at 6 sharp, followed by an hour of reading financial newspapers while watching Lake Michigan shimmer in the early sunlight. The Wall Street Journal lay folded beside my breakfast plate, its headlines discussing market volatility and economic forecasts that no longer held the urgent importance they once did. My reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows showed an elderly man in a burgundy robe, silver hair still thick despite the years, hands steady enough to manage the delicate china cup that held my morning espresso. The apartment around me spoke of decades of careful financial planning, imported Italian furniture, original artwork, a kitchen equipped with professional-grade appliances I rarely used since Margaret passed away 3 years ago. The silence had become my companion in this 32nd floor sanctuary. No rushing footsteps of grandchildren, no animated conversations between family members, no background noise of a household filled with life and laughter. Just the distant hum of traffic far below and the occasional ping of my phone receiving messages I rarely bothered to answer immediately. When the phone rang at 8:15, I almost didn't answer. The caller ID showed Rachel's name, and our conversations had grown increasingly strained over the past year. My daughter's voice had taken on a tone of forced patience whenever she spoke to me, as if she were dealing with a confused child rather than the man who had built a successful construction empire from nothing. "Hi, Dad," she said, her voice carrying that familiar note of obligation. "How are you feeling today?" The question itself had become a source of irritation. How was I feeling? Like a man whose family had decided he was no longer capable of managing his own life, despite the fact that I still read 3 newspapers daily, manage my own investments, and could discuss current events with more clarity than most people half my age. "I'm fine, Rachel, same as I was yesterday when you asked." "Dad, we need to talk. Can I come over this afternoon? Marcus and I have been discussing your situation, and we think it's time to make some changes." My situation? The phrase had become Rachel's favorite euphemism for what she perceived as my declining mental capacity and increasing need for supervision. Never mind that I'd successfully negotiated a multi-million-dollar property sale just 6 months ago, or that my investment portfolio continued to outperform the market under my personal management. "What kind of changes?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the direction this conversation would take. "Well, the apartment is getting too big for you to manage alone. And after what happened last month with Mrs. Henderson from downstairs." Mrs. Henderson, our building's self-appointed coordinator of senior citizen activities, had made the mistake of suggesting I might benefit from a meal delivery service during one of her unsolicited visits. I'd politely but firmly explained that I was perfectly capable of preparing my own meals and didn't require assistance. Somehow, this had been translated into a story about my supposed inability to care for myself, which had made its way back to Rachel through the building's informal gossip network. "Mrs. Henderson misunderstood a perfectly normal conversation," I said. "There's nothing wrong with my ability to manage this apartment or anything else." "Dad, you're 74 years old. You're living alone in a huge place, 32 floors up. What if something happens? What if you fall and can't get help?" The irony wasn't lost on me. Rachel lived in a modest suburban house in Oak Park, struggling to make mortgage payments on a teacher's salary while her husband Marcus worked irregular hours as a freelance graphic designer. Meanwhile, I lived in luxury that I'd earned through 5 decades of 12-hour workdays, calculated risks, and financial discipline that had built Morrison Construction into one of Chicago's most respected building companies. Rachel, I have a medical alert system, I have doormen available 24 hours a day, I have neighbors on this floor, and I have you checking on me constantly. I'm hardly isolated. That's not the point, Dad. The point is that you're holding on to things you don't really need anymore. This apartment, the car you barely drive, all the expenses that come with maintaining a lifestyle that doesn't make sense for someone your age. Someone my age. As if turning 74 had automatically stripped me of decision-making capability and the right to enjoy the fruits of my labor. Rachel spoke as if my age were a disability rather than an achievement, especially considering the childhood pneumonia that doctors had said might shorten my lifespan significantly. Rachel, I bought this apartment because I wanted to live here. I maintain this lifestyle because I can afford it and because I enjoy it. My age doesn't change either of those facts. But Dad, think about the future. Think about what happens when you really do need care. Wouldn't it make more sense to move somewhere more practical now while you're still able to make the transition easily? The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, following the same circular pattern that had become routine in our recent interactions. Rachel presented increasingly creative arguments for why I should abandon the life I'd built for myself, while I attempted to explain that competence and independence don't automatically disappear on one's 74th birthday. When she finally hung up with a promise to visit that afternoon, I sat in my leather recliner over the lake, trying to understand when my daughter had appointed herself as my guardian. The shift had been gradual but unmistakable. Phone calls that had once covered family news and shared interests now focused exclusively on her concerns about my living situation, my health, and my supposed need for increasing supervision. Marcus had clearly been influencing these conversations. My son-in-law had never shown much interest in my well-being during the 15 years he'd been married to Rachel, but lately he'd begun offering opinions about senior living facilities and the benefits of simplified lifestyles for elderly people. His sudden concern for my well-being coincided suspiciously with his recent complaints about their mortgage payments and student loan debt. The afternoon sunlight streamed through my windows as I prepared for Rachel's visit. I made sure the apartment was immaculate, not because it was ever truly messy, but because I wanted to eliminate any excuse for criticism about my housekeeping abilities. The kitchen counters gleamed, the hardwood floors were spotless, and fresh flowers from the building's concierge service brightened the living room. At 3 o'clock precisely, the doorman called to announce Rachel's arrival. I opened the door to find my daughter looking around the apartment with the appraising eye of someone conducting an inspection rather than visiting her father. She'd brought a leather portfolio and wore the expression of someone prepared for a serious business meeting. "The place looks nice, Dad," she said, though her tone suggested she was surprised rather than pleased. "Thank you. Would you like some coffee? I just made a fresh pot." "Sure, that would be good." I moved toward the kitchen, but Rachel followed closely, watching my movements with the attention of someone looking for signs of impairment. When I reached for cups from the upper cabinet, she stepped forward as if ready to assist, then caught herself and stepped back with obvious effort. "Dad, I've been thinking a lot about our conversation this morning, and Marcus and I really believe it's time to start planning for some changes in your living situation." "What specific changes are you suggesting?" Rachel opened her portfolio and pulled out several brochures for senior living communities. The glossy photographs showed smiling elderly people in group activities, communal dining rooms, and small apartment units designed for what the marketing materials called maintenance-free living. I looked through the brochures, noting the amenities that were presented as benefits but felt like limitations. Shared dining rooms instead of my gourmet kitchen, scheduled activities instead of the freedom to pursue my own interests. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Small apartments instead of the spacious home I'd worked decades to afford. "Rachel, these places are for people who need assistance with daily living. I don't need assistance with daily living. Not yet, but Dad, you're not going to stay healthy forever. Wouldn't it be better to make this transition while you're still mentally sharp and physically capable, rather than waiting until there's a crisis?" The implications stung more than I expected. Rachel was essentially arguing that I should abandon my independence preemptively, based on problems I might develop at some unspecified future date. It was like suggesting I should use a wheelchair because I might eventually break a leg. "And what would happen to this apartment?" I asked. "Well, obviously, you'd sell it. That would give you a substantial amount of money to fund your care in these facilities. Many of them have entry fees, but with what you'd get from selling this place, money wouldn't be an issue." "Money wouldn't be an issue," I repeated slowly. "Rachel, do you have any idea what this apartment is worth in today's market?" She looked uncomfortable. "I know it's valuable, Dad. That's part of why selling it makes sense. You'd have more than enough to cover your expenses for years." "More than enough," I said. "And what would happen to the surplus?" Rachel's face flushed slightly. "Well, obviously, that would be part of your estate eventually, but the important thing is making sure you're properly cared for now." I studied my daughter's face, seeing something I'd never noticed before. Behind her concern for my welfare was a calculation about asset management and financial planning that had very little to do with my immediate needs or preferences. Rachel wasn't just worried about my safety, she was worried about the preservation of what she apparently considered her future inheritance. "Rachel, let me ask you a direct question. Are you suggesting these changes because you genuinely believe I'm unable to care for myself, or because you're concerned about what might happen to my assets if I continue living independently?" "Dad, that's not fair. This is about your safety and well-being. Answer the question, please." "Of course I care about your safety. But yes, I also think it's responsible to plan for the future. If something happens to you, if you need expensive medical care or long-term assistance, it could eat up everything you've worked for. Moving to a more practical living situation now would protect your assets and ensure you get proper care." The honesty was refreshing, even though it confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. Rachel's concern wasn't primarily about my happiness or my autonomy. It was about risk management for the family's financial future. She wanted me to sell my apartment and move to institutional care, not because I needed it, but because it would preserve more money for eventual distribution to her and her children. "Rachel, I appreciate your concern about my future care needs, but I'm not ready to give up my independence based on problems I don't currently have. If and when I need assistance, we can discuss appropriate options at that time." "But Dad, you're being unrealistic. You're 74 years old, living alone in a huge apartment, spending money on maintenance and expenses that don't make sense anymore. You're not thinking clearly about what's practical." Not thinking clearly. The words hit like a physical blow. My daughter, the child I'd supported through college, whose wedding I'd paid for, whose first house down payment I'd provided, was questioning my mental competence because I refused to abandon the life I'd built for myself. "Rachel, my thinking is perfectly clear. I understand exactly what you're suggesting and why you're suggesting it. I'm choosing not to follow your advice because I believe my judgment about my own life is still reliable." "Your judgment?" Rachel's voice rose slightly. "Dad, you're holding on to things you don't need, spending money you should be conserving, and refusing to accept help you're going to need eventually. How is that good judgment?" The conversation was deteriorating rapidly. What had started as a discussion about living arrangements had become an argument about my basic competence and right to self-determination. Rachel seemed genuinely convinced that my refusal to follow her advice was evidence of declining mental capacity, rather than a reasonable difference of opinion. "Rachel, I think we should end this conversation before we say things we'll regret." "No, Dad, we need to talk about this. Marcus and I have been discussing this for months, and we're really worried about you. You're isolated up here, you're not taking care of yourself properly, and you're making decisions that don't make sense for someone in your situation." "What decisions specifically don't make sense?" "Like keeping this huge apartment when you could live comfortably in a much smaller space. Like maintaining expenses for things you barely use. Like refusing to consider what's going to happen when you really do need help." "Rachel, this apartment isn't too large for me. I use every room. The expenses aren't unreasonable for someone with my income. And I'm not refusing to consider future care needs.
I'm refusing to make premature decisions based on hypothetical problems. Hypothetical? Rachel stood up, her voice taking on a sharp edge. Dad, you're 74 years old. These aren't hypothetical problems, they're inevitable problems. And the longer you wait to deal with them, the harder it's going to be for everyone. Everyone meaning you and Marcus? Everyone meaning the family, Dad. When you need care, it's going to affect all of us. We're going to be the ones dealing with the logistics, making the arrangements, handling the financial complications. Don't you think we should have some input into decisions that are going to impact our lives too? The mask was finally slipping. Rachel's concern wasn't about my welfare. It was about minimizing the inconvenience my eventual care needs might create for her and her husband. She wanted me to make decisions now that would simplify their future responsibilities, regardless of how those decisions might affect my current quality of life. Rachel, I understand that my future care needs may create responsibilities for you, but that doesn't give you the right to make decisions about my life now based on your convenience later. Convenience? Rachel's face flushed with anger. Dad, this isn't about convenience, it's about reality. You're living in a fantasy where you think you're going to stay healthy and independent forever. That's not realistic for someone your age. Someone my age. I repeated the phrase slowly. Rachel, what exactly do you think happens to people when they turn 74? Do we automatically become incompetent? Do we lose the right to make our own decisions? You're twisting what I'm saying. I'm not saying you're incompetent. I'm saying you're not thinking clearly about the future. And you are? Yes, I am. Because I'm looking at this objectively, without the emotional attachment you have to this place and this lifestyle that doesn't make sense anymore. The conversation had reached a point where continued discussion would only cause more damage to our relationship. No, Dad, we need to talk about this. Marcus and I have been discussing this for months, and we're really worried about you. You're isolated up here, you're not taking care of yourself properly, and you're making decisions that don't make sense for someone in your situation. What decisions specifically don't make sense? Like keeping this huge apartment when you could live comfortably in a much smaller space. Like maintaining expenses for things you barely use. Like refusing to consider what's going to happen when you really do need help. Rachel, this apartment isn't too large for me. I use every room. The expenses aren't unreasonable for someone with my income, and I'm not refusing to consider future care needs. I'm refusing to make premature decisions based on hypothetical problems. Hypothetical? Rachel stood up, her voice taking on a sharp edge. Dad, you're 74 years old. These aren't hypothetical problems, they're inevitable problems. And the longer you wait to deal with them, the harder it's going to be for everyone. Everyone meaning you and Marcus? Everyone meaning the family, Dad. When you need care, it's going to affect all of us. We're going to be the ones dealing with the logistics, making the arrangements, handling the financial complications. Don't you think we should have some input into decisions that are going to impact our lives too? The mask was finally slipping. Rachel's concern wasn't about my welfare. It was about minimizing the inconvenience my eventual care needs might create for her and her husband. She wanted me to make decisions now that would simplify their future responsibilities, regardless of how those decisions might affect my current quality of life. Rachel, I understand that my future care needs may create responsibilities for you, but that doesn't give you the right to make decisions about my life now based on your convenience later. Convenience? Rachel's face flushed with anger. Dad, this isn't about convenience, it's about reality. You're living in a fantasy where you think you're going to stay healthy and independent forever. That's not realistic for someone your age. Someone my age. I repeated the phrase slowly. Rachel, what exactly do you think happens to people when they turn 74? Do we automatically become incompetent? Do we lose the right to make our own decisions? You're twisting what I'm saying. I'm not saying you're incompetent. I'm saying you're not thinking clearly about the future. And you are? Yes, I am. Because I'm looking at this objectively, without the emotional attachment you have to this place and this lifestyle that doesn't make sense anymore. The conversation had reached a point where continued discussion would only cause more damage to our relationship.
Rachel had made her position clear. She believed my age alone justified her intervention in my living arrangements, and my resistance to her suggestions was evidence of impaired judgment rather than legitimate disagreement. Rachel, I think you should leave now. Dad, you can't just dismiss this conversation because you don't like what I'm saying. I'm not dismissing it. I'm ending it because it's becoming destructive. Destructive? Rachel's voice cracked with frustration. Dad, what's destructive is your refusal to face reality. What's destructive is your insistence on holding on to things you don't need while making decisions that are going to create problems for everyone who cares about you. Everyone who cares about me, or everyone who stands to inherit from me? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Rachel's face went white, then red, as she struggled to formulate a response that would deny the financial motivations I'd identified. That's a horrible thing to say, Dad. Is it untrue? Of course it's untrue. This has nothing to do with inheritance. This has to do with your safety and your future care needs. Then why are you so concerned about preserving my assets? Why is your solution to every problem selling this apartment and moving me to a facility that costs less money? Because that's what makes sense financially. Because spending money unnecessarily now means less money available for care later. Unnecessarily? I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 74 years in my joints and muscles. Rachel, I've worked 50 years to afford the lifestyle I'm living now. I'm healthy, I'm mentally competent, and I'm financially secure. Nothing about my current situation is unnecessary except your interference. Interference? Rachel's voice rose to almost a shout. Dad, I'm trying to help you plan for your future because you're too stubborn to do it yourself. Too stubborn or too independent? What's the difference? The difference is that stubborn implies I'm wrong, and independent implies I have the right to be right about my own life. Rachel grabbed her portfolio from the coffee table, shoving the brochures back inside with sharp, angry movements. Her face was flushed, her breathing quick and shallow with the frustration of someone who couldn't understand why her obviously reasonable suggestions were being rejected. Fine, Dad. If you want to live in denial about your situation, that's your choice. But don't expect Marcus and me to just stand by and watch you make decisions that are going to create problems for everyone. What kind of problems, specifically? Problems like what happens when you fall and break a hip in this apartment and there's no one here to help you. Problems like what happens when you start having memory issues and you're up here alone making financial decisions that don't make sense. Problems like what happens when you need round-the-clock care and we have to figure out how to arrange it in a place that wasn't designed for someone with health issues. Rachel, those are all potential future problems based on things that haven't happened yet. They're inevitable problems, Dad, and the longer you wait to address them, the fewer options you're going to have. So your solution is to address them now while they're still imaginary? My solution is to be realistic about what's coming and plan accordingly, instead of living in denial until there's a crisis. And my solution is to live my life as a competent adult until there's actual evidence that I'm no longer capable of doing so. Rachel walked toward the door, her movements sharp with anger and frustration. She turned back one final time, her face showing the disappointment of someone who felt she'd been trying to help and been rejected unreasonably. Dad, you're making a mistake. You're so determined to prove you're still independent that you're not thinking clearly about what's best for you or for the people who care about you. Rachel, what's best for me is maintaining my autonomy and dignity as long as I'm capable of doing so. What's best for the people who care about me is respecting my right to make my own decisions about my own life, even when those decisions don't make sense, even when they don't make sense to you. She left without saying goodbye, the door closing behind her with a finality that felt permanent. I stood in my living room, surrounded by the luxury I'd earned and the independence I'd fought to maintain, feeling more alone than I had since Margaret's death. The silence that followed Rachel's departure was different from the peaceful quiet I'd grown accustomed to. This was the silence of a relationship that had been damaged, perhaps beyond repair. My daughter had made it clear that she believed my age alone justified her intervention in my life, and I had made it equally clear that I disagreed.
But the conversation had revealed something more troubling than a simple disagreement about living arrangements. Rachel's insistence on asset preservation and practical planning suggested that she was already thinking of my resources as family property rather than personal wealth that I had the right to enjoy or spend as I chose. The irony was painful. I had spent 50 years building a fortune specifically so that I could live comfortably in my later years and provide security for my family. Now my daughter was arguing that living comfortably was wasteful and that I should restrict my lifestyle to preserve more money for her eventual inheritance. I walked to my bedroom and opened the safe behind the painting that Margaret had insisted we hang despite my protests about its abstract style. Inside, along with important documents and family jewelry, was a folder containing our financial statements and investment summaries that I reviewed monthly to stay current with our holdings. Morrison Construction had been sold 5 years earlier to a national building company for an amount that had exceeded even my optimistic projections. The investment of those proceeds, combined with decades of careful saving and wise financial planning, had created a portfolio that generated more income annually than most people earned from full-time employment. Rachel had no idea of the true extent of my wealth. She knew I was comfortable, knew I'd been successful, but she'd never seen the actual numbers that represented a lifetime of careful financial management and business success. Her suggestions about asset preservation and practical living arrangements were based on assumptions about my financial situation that were decades out of date. Perhaps it was time she learned the truth about what she was asking me to give up and what she was really fighting to preserve for herself. I pulled out my most recent portfolio statement and studied the numbers that represented everything I'd built over 5 decades of hard work. The total was substantial enough that I could live in luxury for the rest of my life and still leave Rachel and her children more money than they could spend in several lifetimes. But that wasn't the point. The point was that this money represented my freedom, my security, and my right to make choices about my own life. Rachel's assumption that I should minimize my expenses to maximize her inheritance revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of who owned this wealth and who had the right to make decisions about it. Tomorrow, I would call my attorney and my financial advisor. If Rachel wanted to treat my assets as family property, then she needed to understand exactly what property she was trying to manage. And if she truly believed that my judgment was impaired, then she needed to see evidence of the financial acumen that had built the fortune she was so eager to preserve. The sunset over Lake Michigan painted my apartment in golden light as I considered the conversation that would follow. Rachel thought I was being unrealistic about my situation. Tomorrow, she would discover just how realistic I'd actually been about everything that mattered. The morning after Rachel's visit brought a clarity I hadn't experienced in months. I woke before dawn, as had been my habit for 50 years, and sat with my coffee watching the city emerge from darkness below. The conversation with my daughter had crystallized something that had been building for weeks. The realization that my family's perception of my situation was based on assumptions rather than facts. At exactly 9 o'clock, I called my attorney's office. David Chen had handled Morrison Construction's legal affairs for 20 years, including the complex negotiations surrounding the company's sale. He was one of the few people who understood the full scope of my financial situation and had helped structure the investments that continued to generate substantial income years after my retirement. Harold, David's voice carried the warmth of a long professional relationship. "I was just thinking about you yesterday. How are you enjoying retirement?" "Actually, David, that's why I'm calling. I need to schedule a meeting to discuss some family matters that may require legal guidance." "Of course. Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine from my perspective, but I'm dealing with some family pressure about my living situation and financial decisions. I'd like to review my options for protecting my autonomy and ensuring my wishes are respected." David's tone shifted to professional alertness. "Harold, are we talking about estate planning, or are there immediate concerns about your decision-making capacity?" "The latter, unfortunately."
My daughter seems to believe that my age alone justifies her intervention in my personal affairs. I want to make sure I have legal protections in place if this situation escalates. I can see you this afternoon if that works. 2 o'clock? Perfect. My next call was to Jennifer Walsh, my financial advisor and portfolio manager. Jennifer had taken over my account 3 years earlier when her predecessor retired, and she demonstrated both competence and respect for my continued involvement in investment decisions. Unlike some advisors who treated elderly clients as passive participants in their own financial planning, Jennifer regularly sought my input and kept me informed about market opportunities. Mr. Morrison, good morning. I hope you're calling with another one of your market insights. Your prediction about tech sector consolidation last month was spot on. Actually, Jennifer, I'm calling about a family matter that may require documentation of my financial capacity and decision-making competence. Oh, her voice became immediately serious. Are there concerns being raised about your mental acuity? My daughter believes my age automatically impairs my judgment about financial and living arrangements. I want to have professional documentation available if she continues to challenge my autonomy. Mr. Morrison, I can tell you without hesitation that your financial understanding and decision-making ability remain exceptionally sharp. Your portfolio performance under your guidance continues to outpace most professional managers. Would you like me to prepare a formal assessment? Yes, and I'd also like you to prepare a comprehensive portfolio summary that clearly shows my financial position. I have a feeling it's time my family understand exactly what they're trying to manage. I can have both documents ready by tomorrow morning. After completing these calls, I spent the morning reviewing financial records and correspondence from the past year. The picture that emerged was of someone whose mental acuity and business judgment remained as sharp as they'd been during my active working years. Investment decisions, property management choices, and financial planning strategies all reflected careful analysis and successful outcomes. The irony was painful. Rachel was arguing for asset preservation based on the assumption that I might make poor financial decisions, while the evidence showed that my financial decisions continued to significantly outpace market averages. She wanted to protect my money from my supposedly impaired judgment, when my judgment was actually the reason there was so much money to protect. At 2 o'clock, I sat across from David Chen in his downtown office, surrounded by law books and certificates that spoke to decades of successful legal practice. David had aged well since we'd first worked together. His hair was now completely silver, but his eyes retained the sharp intelligence that had made him invaluable during complex business negotiations. Harold, tell me exactly what's been happening with Rachel. I described the previous day's conversation in detail, including her suggestions about senior living facilities, her concern about asset preservation, and her assertion that my judgment was impaired by age. David listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on his legal pad. Has she made any direct threats about seeking guardianship or conservatorship? He asked when I finished. Not explicitly, but she's clearly frustrated by my refusal to follow her advice. She seems to believe that my age alone justifies her intervention in my personal decisions. Harold, let me be very clear about something. Being 74 years old is not grounds for loss of legal capacity. Age alone cannot be used to justify guardianship or conservatorship proceedings. There would need to be specific evidence of cognitive impairment or inability to manage your affairs. And if someone tried to present such evidence, they would need to demonstrate to a court that you lack the mental capacity to make informed decisions about your personal care or financial management. Given your continued successful management of complex investments and your articulate communication, such a claim would be very difficult to substantiate. David pulled out a folder from his desk drawer. However, I'd like to suggest some proactive measures to protect your autonomy. First, we should update your advance directives and power of attorney documents to clearly specify your preferences about living arrangements and medical care. Second, I'd recommend a comprehensive cognitive assessment from a qualified neuropsychologist to establish a baseline of your mental capacity. You think it might come to that? I think it's better to have documentation and not need it than to need documentation and not have it. Family disputes about elderly parents often escalate when financial assets are substantial. Substantial, I repeated. David, does Rachel have any legal right to information about my financial situation? Not unless you're declared incompetent or you voluntarily provide it. Your financial information is private unless you choose to share it or a court orders disclosure as part of competency proceedings. Then perhaps it's time I chose to share it. David leaned back in his chair, studying my face with the attention of someone trying to understand the strategy behind a business decision. Harold, what exactly are you considering? Rachel's entire argument is based on assumptions about my financial situation that are decades out of date. She's worried about asset preservation and practical living expenses based on numbers she's never actually seen. Maybe it's time she understands what she's really fighting to protect. That could change the dynamic significantly. It could also clarify whether her concern is genuinely about my welfare or primarily about her inheritance. David nodded slowly. Harold, that's a fair point, but I want you to consider the potential consequences. Once Rachel sees the full extent of your wealth, it might increase her pressure for you to move to less expensive living arrangements. It might also create new tensions if she realizes how much money she stands to inherit. Or it might help her understand that I can afford to live exactly as I choose for the rest of my life without compromising her future financial security. Possibly, but it might also make her more determined to ensure that wealth is preserved rather than spent on what she considers unnecessary expenses. I thought about David's warning as I considered my options. There was risk in revealing my true financial position to Rachel, but there was also risk in continuing to let her make decisions based on incomplete information. If she was going to continue challenging my autonomy, she needed to understand exactly what was at stake. David, prepare the protective documents we discussed, but also prepare a comprehensive financial disclosure that shows my complete net worth and annual income. I want Rachel to understand exactly what she's asking me to give up. All right, but Harold, I strongly recommend that we also arrange for that cognitive assessment I mentioned. If this situation escalates to legal challenges, having professional documentation of your mental capacity will be crucial. Schedule it for next week. And Harold, one more thing. If you do decide to show Rachel these financial documents, I recommend doing it in a controlled environment with a witness present. Family conversations about substantial wealth can become very emotional very quickly. I left David's office with a plan forming in my mind. Rachel wanted to treat my living situation as a family decision rather than a personal choice. She wanted to manage my assets as if they were already part of her inheritance. Tomorrow, when Jennifer provided the portfolio summary, Rachel would discover that the money she was trying to preserve was far more substantial than she'd ever imagined. But first, I wanted to understand exactly what my family had been saying about me behind my back. If Rachel and Marcus had been discussing my supposed incompetence for months, there were probably other family members who had been brought into these conversations. I needed to know the full scope of the coalition that was forming around the belief that I needed supervision. That evening, I called my brother Thomas in Phoenix. Tom was 2 years younger than me, recently retired from his dental practice, and the only person in our family who had experienced similar pressure from adult children concerned about aging parents. Our father had lived independently until age 88, stubbornly resisting our attempts to convince him to move to assisted living until a stroke finally forced the decision we'd all been advocating. Harold, good to hear from you. How's retirement treating you? Complicated question, Tom. I'm calling because I'm dealing with some family pressure about my living situation, and I wanted to get your perspective. Let me guess, Rachel thinks you should move to a senior community? The fact that Tom immediately understood the situation suggested that these conversations had extended beyond Rachel and Marcus. How did you know?
She called me last month asking for my opinion about your situation. Apparently, she's worried about you living alone in that big apartment. What did you tell her? I told her you seemed perfectly capable of managing your own affairs the last time we talked, and that moving someone out of their home prematurely can actually accelerate cognitive decline. I don't think that's what she wanted to hear. Tom, did she give you any specifics about why she thinks I need supervision? Nothing concrete. She mentioned that you'd been making some decisions that concerned her, but when I asked for examples, she was pretty vague. Something about maintaining expenses that weren't practical for someone your age. Anything else? She asked me if I'd noticed any changes in your thinking or memory during our conversations. I told her you still seemed sharper than most people half your age. The picture was becoming clearer. Rachel had been conducting informal surveys of family members looking for support for her position that I needed intervention. The fact that she hadn't found the backing she was hoping for might explain why she'd become more direct in her recent approaches to me. Tom, did she say anything about my financial situation? She mentioned that you were spending money on things you didn't really need, and that it might be better to preserve assets for future care needs. But Harold, she seemed to be talking about fairly modest amounts, apartment maintenance, car expenses, things like that. I got the impression she was worried about you gradually depleting your savings. Gradually depleting my savings, I repeated. Tom, did she give you any numbers? No specific amounts, but she seemed to think you were living beyond what was prudent for someone on a fixed retirement income. The conversation with Tom confirmed what I'd suspected. Rachel's entire campaign was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of my financial situation. She was operating under the assumption that I was a typical retiree living on Social Security and modest savings, gradually spending down assets that needed to be carefully preserved. She had no idea that my annual investment income alone exceeded most people's working salaries. The next morning, Jennifer arrived at my apartment at 10 o'clock with a leather portfolio containing the documents I'd requested. She spread them across my dining room table with the systematic precision of someone accustomed to presenting complex financial information to clients. Mr. Morrison, here's the comprehensive portfolio summary you requested. As you can see, your total net worth has increased by 8% since last year, despite the distributions you've been taking for living expenses. I studied the numbers that represented a lifetime of careful financial planning and successful business decisions. The total was substantial enough that I could maintain my current lifestyle for several decades while still leaving my family a considerable inheritance. The annual income from investments alone was more than enough to cover all my expenses, with substantial amounts left over for additional savings or discretionary spending. Jennifer, this document clearly shows that my living expenses represent what percentage of my annual income? Less than 30%, even including the apartment maintenance, car expenses, and discretionary spending your daughter mentioned to you. You're actually saving money every year while living in luxury. And at this rate of spending, how long would my assets last? Mr. Morrison, at your current rate of spending, your portfolio would actually continue growing indefinitely. The investment returns exceed your expenses by a significant margin. You could double your living expenses and still leave your heirs substantially more than your current net worth. I asked Jennifer to prepare a simplified summary that would clearly illustrate these points for someone without financial expertise. The document she created showed my net worth, annual income, annual expenses, and projected portfolio growth over the next 20 years. The numbers told a story that would fundamentally change Rachel's understanding of my situation. Mr. Morrison, may I ask what prompted this documentation? My family believes I'm being financially irresponsible by maintaining my current lifestyle. They're concerned about asset preservation for future care needs. Jennifer looked at the documents spread across the table, then back at me with an expression of confused disbelief. Mr. Morrison, with respect to your family, their concerns about asset preservation are completely unfounded. You could live in luxury for the rest of your life and still leave them more money than most people accumulate in multiple lifetimes. I suspect they don't realize that. Would you like me to present these documents to them directly? Sometimes financial information is more credible coming from a professional advisor. Actually, Jennifer, I think I'd prefer to handle this conversation myself. After Jennifer left, I sat in my living room reviewing the documents that would change everything between Rachel and me. The numbers were undeniable evidence that her concerns about my financial decisions were based on assumptions rather than facts. But they were also evidence of wealth substantial enough to fundamentally alter family dynamics if not handled carefully. I called Rachel that afternoon, keeping my voice neutral and conversational. Rachel, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I'd like to continue the discussion. Could you and Marcus come over tomorrow evening? Dad, I'm glad you called. Marcus and I have been talking, and we really want to find a solution that works for everyone. I'm sure we can work something out. There are some things about my situation that I think would be helpful for you to understand. What kind of things? Financial information that might change your perspective about the decisions I've been making. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Dad, are you having money problems? Because if you are, we can help figure out solutions. No, Rachel, I'm not having money problems. Quite the opposite, actually. I don't understand. You will tomorrow evening. Can you be here at 7? Of course. Dad, is everything okay? You sound different. Everything's fine, Rachel. I just think it's time we had a completely honest conversation about my situation. After hanging up, I spent the evening preparing for a conversation that would either resolve our family conflict or escalate it to an entirely new level. Tomorrow, Rachel would discover that the father she'd been treating as a financially vulnerable elderly man was actually wealthier than she'd ever imagined. The question was whether that knowledge would make her more or less determined to control my living situation. I arranged the financial documents on my coffee table, organizing them in a sequence that would tell the story clearly and undeniably. Net worth summary first, followed by annual income documentation, then the analysis showing how my current expenses related to my total resources. Finally, Jennifer's projections showing how my wealth would continue to grow even if I maintained or increased my current spending levels. The evening light through my apartment windows illuminated the papers that would change everything between my daughter and me. Tomorrow, Rachel would understand exactly what she'd been asking me to give up when she suggested I sell this apartment and move to institutional care. She would also understand that her inheritance was far more secure than she'd ever realized. But more importantly, she would be forced to confront the real motivations behind her concern for my welfare. Once she knew that money was not an issue, would she still insist that I needed supervision? Once she understood that asset preservation was unnecessary, would she still argue for practical living arrangements? Once she realized that I could afford any level of care I might ever need, would she still claim that my judgment was impaired by age? The next evening would answer all of these questions and determine whether our family relationship could survive the truth about money, control, and the intersection between love and inheritance. At exactly 7 o'clock the next evening, the doorman called to announce Rachel and Marcus's arrival. I opened the door to find them both looking slightly apprehensive, as if they weren't sure what to expect from this conversation but sensed it would be significant. "Come in," I said, gesturing toward the living room where the financial documents waited on the coffee table. "Can I get you anything to drink?"
"Just water for me," Rachel said, glancing around the apartment as if seeing it for the first time. Marcus nodded agreement, his attention already drawn to the papers spread across the table. I brought them glasses of water and settled into my chair across from the sofa where they sat together. The financial documents lay between us like evidence in a trial, waiting to be examined and interpreted. "Rachel, you've spent the last several weeks expressing concern about my financial decisions and my ability to manage my affairs responsibly. You've suggested that I should sell this apartment, move to less expensive housing, and modify my lifestyle to preserve assets for future care needs. Dad, we're just worried about your security and making sure you have enough money for whatever you might need as you get older. I understand that's your stated concern, but I think your advice has been based on assumptions about my financial situation that are no longer accurate. I'd like to show you the current reality of my financial position." I handed her the portfolio summary that Jennifer had prepared. Rachel took it with the careful attention of someone expecting to see either very good news or very bad news. Marcus leaned over to read along, his expression shifting from casual interest to focused attention as he began to understand what the numbers represented. Rachel read through the first page in silence, her face showing a progression of emotions that moved from concern to confusion to shock. When she looked up at me, her expression was completely different from anything I'd seen during our recent conversations. "Dad, these numbers, this can't be right." "I assure you it's completely accurate. Those documents were prepared by my financial advisor yesterday specifically for this conversation." Marcus took the papers from Rachel's hands, studying them with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. His background in graphic design apparently hadn't prepared him for the task of interpreting investment portfolios, but the bottom-line numbers were clear enough for anyone to understand. "Harold," Marcus said slowly, "this shows assets of yes, and annual income of yes." Rachel stood up abruptly, walking to the window that overlooked Lake Michigan. Her shoulders were tense, her breathing rapid and shallow. When she turned back to face me, her expression showed a mixture of emotions I couldn't immediately identify. "Dad, why didn't you tell us?" "Tell you what, specifically?" "That you have this much money, that you're this financially secure." "Rachel, did you ever ask?" The question hung in the air between us. In all our conversations about my living expenses and future care needs, Rachel had never directly inquired about the extent of my resources. She'd operated on assumptions based on her general knowledge of typical retirement situations, never considering that my situation might be far from typical. I
You assumed I was a typical retiree living on limited resources and gradually spending down modest savings. Yes, instead of a man who sold a successful business for enough money to live comfortably for several lifetimes. Rachel returned to the sofa, picking up another page of financial documentation. This one showed my monthly expenses compared to my monthly income, with a chart that made the relationship visually obvious even to someone unfamiliar with financial planning. Dad, this shows that you're only spending about a quarter of your income. Correct. And that your net worth is actually increasing every year. Also correct. Marcus had been quiet during this exchange, but now he leaned forward with a question that went to the heart of our recent family tensions. Harold, if you have this much money, why were you so resistant to our suggestions about financial planning? Because your suggestions weren't about financial planning. They were about lifestyle restriction based on the assumption that I couldn't afford my current expenses. But if money isn't an issue, then what was the real motivation behind your advice? The question created an uncomfortable silence. Rachel and Marcus exchanged glances that suggested they were realizing their arguments about asset preservation and practical living expenses had just lost their foundation. Dad, Rachel said carefully, we were genuinely concerned about your future care needs and making sure you had enough money set aside for emergencies. Rachel, according to these documents, how much money would I need to set aside for the most expensive care scenarios you can imagine? She looked at the papers again, doing mental calculations. I don't know, maybe a few $100,000 for long-term care? And how much do I currently have available for such expenses? The numbers spoke for themselves. Even the most expensive long-term care scenarios would represent a small percentage of my total resources. Rachel was beginning to understand that her concern about asset preservation had been completely unnecessary. Dad, I had no idea. I knew you were comfortable, but I didn't realize you were this secure. Now you do. So I'd like to revisit our conversation about my living situation from yesterday. Marcus shifted uncomfortably on the sofa. Harold, obviously this changes the financial aspects of the discussion. Does it change anything else? What do you mean? Do you still believe my judgment is impaired by age? Do you still think I need supervision for my daily living activities? Do you still believe I should move to institutional care for my own safety? The questions forced them to confront the non-financial aspects of their intervention in my life. If money wasn't an issue, what justification remained for their belief that I needed to change my living situation? Dad, we were worried about you being alone in this big apartment, about what would happen if you had a medical emergency. Those concerns haven't changed just because you now know I have more money than you thought. No, but what, Rachel?
But if you can afford any level of care you might need, then I guess the urgency is different. The urgency or the justification. Rachel looked uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Dad, what are you getting at? I'm getting at the question of whether your concern was genuinely about my welfare or primarily about protecting your inheritance. The accusation created a shocked silence. Marcus's face flushed red, while Rachel's went pale. Neither of them seemed prepared to address the implications of what I'd suggested. Dad, that's not fair, Rachel said finally. Isn't it? Yesterday you were insisting that I needed to sell this apartment and move to less expensive housing to preserve assets for future care needs. Today you discover that I have enough money to maintain this lifestyle indefinitely while still leaving you more than you could spend in multiple lifetimes. Does that change your opinion about whether I should sell this apartment? I need to think about that. While you're thinking, consider this. Every argument you made yesterday about practical living arrangements and asset preservation was based on the assumption that my resources were limited. Now you know they're not. So either you withdraw those arguments or you admit they were never really about protecting my financial security. Marcus stood up and walked to the window, distancing himself from a conversation that was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. When he turned back, his expression showed someone trying to salvage a position that had been fundamentally undermined. Harold, even with unlimited resources, there are still practical considerations about aging and living independently. Such as,
such as the fact that you're 74 years old and living alone in a 32nd floor apartment. Money doesn't eliminate the risks associated with that situation. No, but it does eliminate the need to choose between safety and comfort. If I ever need assistance, I can afford to have it provided here rather than moving to institutional care. But wouldn't it be easier to have that assistance already in place? Easier for whom? Marcus didn't answer immediately, perhaps realizing that easier wasn't necessarily better from my perspective. Rachel picked up the financial documents again, studying them as if they might reveal different information on second reading. Dad, I'm still trying to process all of this. I mean, I'm happy that you're this secure financially, but it also makes me feel like I've been worrying about problems that didn't exist. Which raises the question of why those worries developed in the first place. What do you mean? I mean that someone convinced you I was facing financial pressures that required family intervention. Either you developed these concerns on your own, based on incorrect assumptions, or someone influenced you to believe that my situation was more precarious than it actually was. Rachel and Marcus exchanged another glance, this one carrying implications I couldn't immediately interpret. Dad, nobody influenced us. We made assumptions based on what we thought we knew about your situation. And those assumptions led you to believe that I needed supervision and lifestyle modifications? We thought we were being responsible. We thought we were helping you plan for potential problems. Problems that, as it turns out, don't exist. Apparently not. I stood up and walked to my desk, returning with another folder that contained the documents David Chen had prepared. Rachel, since we're having this completely honest conversation, there's something else you should know. I handed her the legal documents that outlined my advance directives, power of attorney designations, and the cognitive assessment appointment I'd scheduled for next week. What are these? Legal protections I've put in place to ensure that my autonomy and decision-making authority are respected regardless of my age or anyone's concerns about my judgment. Rachel read through the documents with growing alarm. Dad, these are guardianship protection papers. Yes, they are. Why would you need guardianship protection? Because yesterday you told me that my age impaired my judgment and that you and Marcus had been discussing my situation for months. Because you've been pressuring me to make major life changes based on your assessment of my competence rather than my own preferences. Dad, we never said anything about guardianship. You didn't use the word, but you've been arguing that your judgment about my life is more reliable than my own judgment about my life. That's exactly the basis for guardianship proceedings. Marcus returned to the sofa, his expression showing someone who was beginning to understand the legal implications of their recent conversations with me. Harold, we never intended to suggest that you were incompetent. Then what were you suggesting when you said my decisions didn't make sense and that I wasn't thinking clearly about my situation? We thought you were being unrealistic about practical considerations. Practical considerations that, as we've now established, don't actually exist in my situation. The conversation had reached a point where Rachel and Marcus were being forced to confront the fundamental assumptions behind their intervention in my life. Every justification they'd offered for their concern had been based on either financial limitations that didn't exist or age-related impairments they couldn't demonstrate. Dad, Rachel said quietly, I owe you an apology. For what, specifically? For making assumptions about your situation without getting accurate information. For suggesting that your judgment was impaired when the evidence shows it's actually been excellent. For treating you like someone who needed supervision when you're clearly capable of managing your own affairs. And for not respecting your right to make your own decisions about your own life. I sat back down, feeling some of the tension leave my shoulders. Rachel's apology addressed the core issues that had created our conflict, but I needed to understand whether she truly recognized the problematic nature of her recent behavior. Rachel, do you understand why I felt it was necessary to prepare legal protections? Because we made you feel like your autonomy was being threatened. Exactly. And do you understand why that was problematic? Because you're a competent adult who has the right to make his own decisions regardless of his age.
Very good. Now, Marcus, do you have anything to add to this conversation? Marcus had been unusually quiet during Rachel's apology, perhaps recognizing that his role in encouraging her intervention had been inappropriate. When he finally spoke, his words carried the tone of someone trying to extract himself from an untenable position. Harold, I think we all learned something important tonight. I apologize for any pressure we put on you to change your living situation. And do you understand that pressure was based on assumptions that turned out to be completely incorrect? Yes, I do. Good. Then let me be very clear about something.
I am 74 years old, financially secure, mentally competent, and perfectly capable of making my own decisions about my living arrangements, my expenses, and my future care needs. I don't require supervision, advice, or intervention from anyone unless I specifically request it. We understand, Dad. I hope you do, because any future attempts to pressure me into lifestyle changes or to question my decision-making capacity will result in the enforcement of the legal protections I've put in place. The warning was clear and unambiguous. I had the financial resources to live exactly as I chose, and the legal protections to ensure my autonomy was respected. Rachel and Marcus could either accept those facts or find themselves dealing with attorneys and court orders. Dad, that won't be necessary. We understand the situation now. I hope so, Rachel, because this conversation has fundamentally changed our family dynamic. You now know exactly how secure I am financially, and I've made it clear that I won't tolerate future challenges to my autonomy. We can move forward with that understanding, or we can move forward with legal boundaries enforcing it. The evening concluded with Rachel and Marcus studying the financial documents one more time, asking clarifying questions that helped them understand the full scope of my resources and the complete irrelevance of their asset preservation concerns. When they finally left, both seemed subdued by the revelation that their months of worry and planning had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of my situation. I stood at my window overlooking Lake Michigan, watching the city lights reflect on the water below. The conversation had gone better than I'd expected. Rachel had apologized and seemed to genuinely understand why her intervention had been inappropriate. Marcus had backed down from his position about practical living arrangements. Most importantly, they both now understood that money was not an issue and that their concern about asset preservation had been completely unnecessary. But I also recognized that our family relationship had been permanently altered by this conflict. Rachel had revealed that she was capable of challenging my autonomy based on incorrect assumptions about my competence. She had demonstrated a willingness to pressure me into major life changes without fully understanding my situation. Those weren't the actions of someone who respected my right to self-determination. The legal protections would remain in place indefinitely. David Chen's advice about proactive measures had proven wise. Having documentation and not needing it was indeed better than needing documentation and not having it. Tomorrow, I would continue living exactly as I chose, in the apartment I loved, with the lifestyle I'd earned through 50 years of hard work and careful planning. But I would do so with the knowledge that my family's concern for my welfare had been complicated by assumptions about inheritance and control that required careful management. The truth about my financial situation had solved one problem while revealing another. Rachel now knew that her inheritance was more secure than she'd ever imagined, but she also knew that it was substantial enough to influence family dynamics in ways we'd all need to navigate carefully. At least now those dynamics would be based on facts, rather than assumptions, and my autonomy would be protected by both resources and law. 3 weeks had passed since the evening Rachel and Marcus discovered the true extent of my financial situation. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was productive. No more concerned phone calls about my well-being, no more suggestions about practical living arrangements, no more veiled comments about asset preservation. For the first time in months, I could enjoy my morning coffee without wondering what family crisis would interrupt my day. The cognitive assessment Dr. Patricia Vance had conducted proved what I'd already known but needed documented. My mental acuity, memory function, and decision-making capacity all tested well above average for any age group, let alone someone in their 70s.
David Chen now had professional documentation that would make any future competency challenges legally impossible to pursue. On a Thursday morning that started like any other, I received a call that would test everything I'd learned about family dynamics and financial boundaries. "Mr. Morrison?" The voice was unfamiliar, professional, with the careful tone that usually preceded difficult news. "This is Detective Sarah Martinez with Chicago Police Department. I'm calling regarding your daughter Rachel Morrison Taylor." My coffee cup paused halfway to my lips. "Is she all right?" "She's physically fine, sir, but she's been arrested on charges of embezzlement from Lincoln Elementary School where she works. She's asked us to contact you about posting bail." The words hit me like a physical blow. Rachel, who'd spent weeks lecturing me about financial responsibility and practical decision-making, had been arrested for stealing money from an elementary school. The irony was so sharp it almost made me laugh, except nothing about this situation was amusing. "Detective Martinez, what exactly is she accused of?" "She's charged with embezzling approximately $47,000 from the school's fundraising accounts over the past 8 months. The money was discovered missing during their annual audit last week." $47,000. The amount was simultaneously substantial and trivial. Substantial enough to destroy Rachel's career and reputation, trivial enough that I could cover it without impacting my financial situation in any meaningful way. But the number itself wasn't what shocked me most. What shocked me was that Rachel had been stealing money while simultaneously arguing that I needed to modify my lifestyle to preserve assets. "What's the bail amount?" $25,000, sir. "And she specifically asked you to call me?" "Yes, sir. She said you were the only family member with the resources to help." The only family member with the resources to help. After weeks of claiming I was financially irresponsible and wasteful, Rachel now wants to use those very resources to extract herself from a situation that demonstrates actual financial irresponsibility. The contradiction would have been funny if it weren't so tragic. "Detective Martinez, I'll need some time to consider this. Can you tell me what happens if the bail isn't posted?" "She would remain in custody until her arraignment, which is scheduled for Monday morning." "Thank you for calling. I'll be in touch." I hung up and sat in my apartment's silence, processing information that fundamentally changed my understanding of recent family events. Rachel hadn't just been worried about my financial decision-making. She'd been engaged in criminal financial decision-making herself. Her concern about asset preservation hadn't been about protecting my resources for legitimate future needs. It had been about ensuring those resources would be available when she needed them for illegitimate current needs. The timeline was particularly damning. Rachel had begun pressuring me about my living situation and expenses 8 months ago, exactly when the embezzlement had started. Her increasingly desperate arguments about practical living arrangements and her growing frustration with my independence weren't motivated by concern for my welfare. They were motivated by her own increasing financial desperation as she dug herself deeper into criminal behavior. My phone rang again within 10 minutes. Rachel's voice was barely recognizable, thick with tears and desperation. "Dad, I'm sure the police called you. I need help." "Yes, Rachel, they called. $47,000 from an elementary school." "Dad, I can explain everything. It's not what it looks like." "What does look like, Rachel?" "I know how this seems, but I was planning to pay it back. I was just borrowing the money temporarily." "Borrowing without permission is called stealing, Rachel." "Dad, please don't lecture me right now. I need you to post bail so I can get out of here and figure out how to fix this." The entitlement in her voice was staggering. Even from jail, facing criminal charges for theft, Rachel's primary concern was accessing my resources to solve her problem. She showed no recognition that her actions might have consequences beyond immediate inconvenience, no acknowledgement that stealing from children's educational programs was morally reprehensible, no understanding that her request for help was deeply inappropriate given the circumstances. "Rachel, let me make sure I understand this correctly. You've spent months arguing that I'm financially irresponsible and that I need supervision to make good decisions about money. During that same period, you were stealing money from elementary school children. Now you want me to use the resources you called wasteful to bail you out of jail for theft."
Dad, this is different. This is an emergency.
An emergency you created through criminal behavior. I made a mistake, okay? I made a terrible mistake and I need help fixing it. You made a series of calculated criminal decisions over 8 months, Rachel. That's not a mistake. That's a pattern of behavior. Are you going to help me or not? The question was asked with the same tone of entitled expectation she'd used when demanding I change my living situation. Rachel seemed to believe that my resources existed primarily to solve her problems, whether those problems involved lifestyle preferences or criminal consequences. Rachel, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Did your concerns about my financial situation have anything to do with your need for money to cover up the theft? The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough to provide its own answer. Dad, that's not why. That's exactly why, isn't it? You weren't worried about my asset preservation. You were worried about asset availability for when you got caught. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like? I was trying to protect the family's financial future while dealing with temporary problems. Temporary problems that involved stealing money from children. Dad, can we please focus on the immediate situation? I need to get out of here so I can try to make this right. How exactly do you plan to make this right, Rachel? I'll pay back the money. I'll resign from my position. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. With what money will you pay back $47,000? Another silence, this one even longer than the first. I was hoping you might be able to help with that too. The full scope of Rachel's expectations was now clear. She wanted me to post $25,000 in bail money and then provide an additional $47,000 to cover the restitution for her theft. She was asking me to spend $72,000 to solve problems created by her criminal behavior while offering nothing in return except vague promises to make it right. Rachel, let me explain something to you. The money you stole belonged to children's educational programs. The money you want me to provide to fix your problem is money I earned through 50 years of honest work. Do you see the moral difference between those two situations? Dad, I know what I did was wrong. I know I made terrible choices, but I'm still your daughter and I need help. You're my daughter who called me a burden and argued that my judgment was impaired by age while you were simultaneously engaged in criminal activity. You're my daughter who tried to convince me to sell my home and restrict my lifestyle to preserve assets that you were planning to use for illegal purposes. That's not... I wasn't... You weren't what, Rachel? You weren't planning to eventually ask me for money to cover up your theft? You weren't pressuring me to modify my expenses so more money would be available when you needed it. You weren't treating my resources as your emergency fund for criminal consequences. I was trying to protect the family. You were trying to position yourself to exploit the family. The conversation had reached a point where Rachel could either acknowledge the full scope of her manipulative behavior or continue lying about motivations that were now obvious. Her criminal activity provided context that made her recent pressure about my living situation appear calculated and predatory rather than genuinely concerned. Dad, are you going to help me or not? I'm going to help you, Rachel, but not in the way you're expecting. What does that mean? It means I'm going to allow you to experience the consequences of your choices without enabling your continued irresponsibility. You're going to leave me in jail? I'm going to allow the legal system to function as it's designed to function. Dad, you can't be serious. You have more money than you could ever spend, and you're going to let me sit in jail over $25,000? I'm going to let you sit in jail because you stole $47,000 from children's educational programs and then tried to manipulate me into funding your escape from accountability.
This is unbelievable. Your own daughter is asking for help and you're choosing money over family? No, Rachel, I'm choosing consequences over enabling. There's a significant difference. Fine, fine. If that's how you want to be, then don't expect me to be part of your life anymore. Don't expect to see your grandchildren. Don't expect family relationships to continue when you've made it clear that money is more important to you than your own daughter. The threats that once were my greatest fear now felt powerless against the clarity I'd gained about Rachel's true character. A woman who would steal money from elementary school children and then demand that her elderly father pay for her crimes was not someone whose approval I needed to seek. Rachel, those threats stopped working when you revealed who you really are. A woman who would steal money from elementary school children and then demand that her elderly father pay for her crimes is not someone whose family relationships I'm desperate to preserve. You'll regret this, Dad. When you're old and alone and need someone to take care of you, remember this conversation. When I'm old and need care, I'll hire professionals with the money you wanted me to waste on bailing you out of jail for theft. I hung up before she could respond, ending what would likely be our last conversation for a very long time. The silence that followed felt different from the peaceful quiet I'd grown to appreciate. This was the silence of a relationship that had been revealed to be fundamentally fraudulent. Over the following days, I learned more details about Rachel's situation through conversations with her attorney, a public defender named Michael Romano, who contacted me seeking character references and financial assistance for his client. The story that emerged painted a picture of financial desperation that had escalated gradually over several months. Rachel and Marcus had accumulated substantial debt through a combination of poor financial decisions and Marcus's irregular income. Credit cards had been maxed out, a second mortgage had been taken on their house, and they'd borrowed money from friends and relatives to cover basic expenses. Rather than addressing their spending habits or seeking legitimate financial assistance, Rachel had begun taking small amounts from the school's fundraising accounts. What had started as a few $100s borrowed temporarily had grown into a systematic embezzlement scheme that involved falsifying financial records and creating fraudulent receipts to cover the missing money. When the annual audit revealed the discrepancies, Rachel had initially tried to blame accounting errors before eventually confessing to the theft. Mr. Morrison, my daughter is facing serious felony charges that could result in several years in prison. However, if full restitution is made quickly, the prosecution might be willing to consider reduced charges or alternative sentencing.
Romano, I appreciate your call, but I won't be providing financial assistance for this situation. Sir, I understand this is a difficult family situation, but Rachel has 2 young children who will be significantly impacted if their mother goes to prison. Rachel should have considered the impact on her children before she decided to steal money from their classmates' educational programs. Mr. Morrison, with respect, family support during legal crises can make the difference between rehabilitation and destruction. Your daughter needs help, not abandonment. My daughter needs consequences, not rescue. She spent months trying to convince me that my financial judgment was impaired while she was engaged in criminal financial behavior. I won't reward that level of manipulation and hypocrisy. The conversation with Rachel's attorney clarified something important about the difference between helping and enabling. Providing money to cover the consequences of criminal behavior wasn't help. It was participation in a system that taught people their actions don't have meaningful consequences if they have access to sufficient resources. Rachel's children, Emma and Jake, were indeed innocent victims of their mother's choices. But protecting them from the consequences of those choices by funding their mother's escape from accountability would only teach them that criminal behavior is acceptable if you have wealthy relatives willing to solve the problems it creates. 2 weeks later, I received a call from my brother Thomas, who had apparently been contacted by Marcus seeking support for Rachel's situation. "Harold, I just got off the phone with Marcus. He told me about Rachel's arrest." "What exactly did he tell you?"
He said she'd been accused of some financial irregularities at work and that you were refusing to help with bail money despite having the resources to easily cover it. Financial irregularities, I repeated. Tom, she stole $47,000 from elementary school children over 8 months. That's not a financial irregularity, that's systematic theft from educational programs. Harold, I had no idea it was that serious. Marcus made it sound like an accounting dispute. Marcus is trying to minimize his wife's criminal behavior to generate family pressure for me to fund her escape from consequences. But Harold, if you have the money to help… Tom, let me ask you something. If your son was arrested for stealing money from children, would you think the appropriate response was to pay his bail and cover his restitution, or would you think he needed to face the consequences of his choices? I suppose it would depend on the circumstances. The circumstances are that my daughter, who spent months telling me I was financially irresponsible, was simultaneously stealing money from children. The circumstances are that she tried to manipulate me into modifying my lifestyle to preserve assets she was planning to steal. The circumstances are that she's now demanding I use those assets to fund her escape from accountability for criminal behavior. When you put it that way, there's no other way to put it, Tom. Rachel made calculated criminal choices over an extended period while simultaneously lecturing me about financial responsibility. Now she wants me to solve the problems those criminal choices created. What's going to happen to her? She's going to experience the consequences of stealing money from children, exactly as she should. The conversation with Thomas helped me understand how Rachel and Marcus were presenting the situation to other family members. By describing criminal theft as financial irregularities and framing my refusal to pay as unreasonable miserliness, they were attempting to create family pressure that would force me to enable Rachel's escape from accountability. But the manipulation that had once been effective against me no longer worked. I understood now that Rachel's entire relationship with me had been built around accessing my resources rather than maintaining genuine family connections. Her concern for my welfare had been calculated performance designed to position herself for future financial exploitation. A month after Rachel's arrest, I received a letter that would represent our final communication. The envelope was addressed in handwriting I recognized but had never seen looking so uncertain and desperate. "Dad," the letter began, "I'm writing this from county jail where I've had time to think about everything that's happened between us. I know you're angry about the money situation at school, and I know you feel like I've been dishonest with you about my motivations regarding your living situation. I want to explain what really happened and why I need your help now more than ever." The letter continued for 3 pages, outlining a version of events where Rachel's theft was presented as desperate response to family financial crisis rather than criminal greed. According to her narrative, she had only taken the money temporarily and had always planned to return it before anyone noticed. Her pressure about my living situation had been motivated by genuine concern for my welfare rather than calculated positioning for financial exploitation. But the most revealing part of the letter was her proposal for resolving the current crisis. Rachel offered to sign legal documents giving me complete control over her financial decisions in exchange for paying her bail and restitution. She proposed moving into my apartment building where I could monitor her activities and ensure she never engaged in irresponsible behavior again. She promised to submit to any oversight or restrictions I deemed appropriate if I would just provide the money to solve her immediate legal problems. The letter was masterful manipulation disguised as humble submission. Rachel was offering to trade her independence for money while framing the exchange as though she was doing me a favor by accepting my supervision. She wanted me to pay $72,000 for the privilege of managing her life and preventing her from engaging in future criminal behavior. I read the letter twice, appreciating the sophistication of the manipulation while feeling no emotional pull toward the proposed solution. Rachel had revealed her true character through her actions, and no amount of carefully crafted prose could change the fundamental reality of who she'd chosen to become. I wrote a brief response that I had my attorney review before sending. "Rachel, I received your letter and understand your proposal. However, I won't be providing financial assistance for the consequences of your criminal behavior. The character traits that led to your theft from children are the same traits that led to your attempts to manipulate me regarding my living situation.
I don't believe supervision or oversight would change those fundamental characteristics. You'll need to find other resources to address your legal situation. I hope you use this experience to develop the accountability and integrity that should have prevented it in the first place. The letter was delivered to the county jail 2 days later. I never received a response, nor did I expect one. Rachel had exhausted her manipulation tactics and discovered that access to resources didn't automatically grant access to those resources when the person controlling them had learned to recognize exploitation. 6 months later, I learned through the local newspaper that Rachel had pleaded guilty to embezzlement charges and been sentenced to 2 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 18 months. Marcus had filed for divorce while she was awaiting trial, and Emma and Jake were living with his parents in another state. The house in Oak Park had been sold to cover legal expenses and partial restitution to the school. The newspaper article described Rachel as a former teacher who had betrayed the trust of students and families through her criminal behavior. There was no mention of her elderly father who had refused to enable her escape from accountability. The story was complete without that detail because consequences don't require family approval to be effective. I continued living in my apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, enjoying the independence and dignity that I'd fought to preserve. The financial resources that Rachel had tried to manipulate me into redistributing continued to provide security and comfort while earning returns that exceeded my expenses. The legal protections that David Chen had established remained in place, ensuring that future manipulation attempts would be addressed through appropriate channels. Most importantly, I'd learned the difference between loving someone and enabling their destructive behavior. Rachel was still my daughter, and I still hoped she would eventually develop the character traits that would allow her to live with integrity and accountability. But those hopes didn't require me to fund her escape from the consequences that revealed the absence of those very traits. The silence in my apartment was no longer the silence of loneliness, it was the silence of peace. No more manipulative phone calls, no more pressure to modify my lifestyle to accommodate someone else's poor choices, no more threats about access to grandchildren as weapons in financial negotiations. Just the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived and resources well managed by someone who had earned the right to make his own decisions about both. On a clear morning in late spring, I sat with my coffee and newspaper watching the sunrise over Lake Michigan, grateful for the wisdom that had come from learning to distinguish between family loyalty and financial exploitation. The apartment that Rachel had wanted me to sell remained my sanctuary. The lifestyle she had called wasteful continued to bring me joy, and the independence she had tried to compromise was stronger than ever. I'd discovered that the greatest gift I could give my family wasn't unlimited access to my resources. It was the example of someone who maintained dignity, autonomy, and integrity even when pressured to abandon all three. Whether they learned from that example or not was their choice, but the example itself was my legacy, regardless of who chose to inherit it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.